look at verse 10. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10. He says here, "For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil." Literally, is the root of all evil. "And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." The love of money is the root of all evil. My version says sorts, but it's literally the evils, is the root of all the evils. "And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." Notice he does not say that money is the root of all evil, as a lot of people incorrectly quote. But he says that the love of money is the root of all evil. And it's not the love of money like we might typically think of it, like man, I'd love to be financially free or something like that. That's not what he means. What he's talking about is such an overwhelming greed towards money and possessions that you have that basically push everything else out of your life. That comes first. This type of person that loves money in this way in verse 10 is the type of person that would not be afraid to lie, cheat, and steal their way to great wealth and possessions, right? So this passage is not saying that that having money or understanding that you need money or wanting money in order to help out other people and support the church and support your family and things like that is wrong. But this overwhelming, overbearing love of money is what's the root of all sorts of evil. He says earlier in that chapter, in verse 9, that those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. So really what he's saying here is you don't want to go down this route of extreme greed because all it's going to do is bring you all sorts of pain. It's going to bring you to destruction. It's going to pierce yourself with many griefs, as you see in verse 10. So what we're going to do today is kind of test this theory that the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. So to do that, we're going to do sort of some thought experiments and just kind of have some fun and look at the first few chapters of the Bible and things associated with that. We'll get to all that I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. First off, let's kind of define love of money further. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 5. Let's see what love of money really boils down to, what the sin really is, and then we'll define it even more as we go on. He says, "For this you know with certainty, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man," that's another way to describe someone who's a lover of money, is as someone who is covetous, "who is an idolater, has an inheritance in the kingdom of God." See what he says there? So covetousness really is idolatry. Being a lover of money really comes down to being an idolater, right? Idolater. Being an idolatrous person. There we go. I don't know. Some of these words are hard to conjugate, especially on the fly. The point is that someone who's a lover of money is someone who's covetous, and someone who's covetous is someone who is an idolater. So this gives us a lot of room now. Because if we go to passages that are about idolatry, you see, now we have passages that could also be applied to the lover of money. If we go to passages that are about covetousness, we've kind of set up our little triangle there like we like to do in some other passages. What we're going to go to, though, is a passage everybody's familiar with. That's Exodus chapter 20. So let's go there. Exodus chapter 20. We have 10 commandments. The first 3 commandments the first 4 commandments are focused on how we approach God. And then commandments 5 through 10 are really how we interact with other people. But what we're going to see is all these commandments, we're going to pick out a couple of examples, basically boil down to the root of all evil, which is love of money or covetousness. For example, commandment number 4 would be the Sabbath day, right? Verse 8, he says, Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male or your female servants, or your cattle, or your sojourner who stays with you. For in the 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Someone who's a lover of money can't afford to take off on Saturday, right? As you see there in, as he's describing here in Exodus chapter 20. If you have this strong desire to get rich and to be a lover of money, to be covetousness, then you're not going to have time to take breaks and to rest and relax. You had to constantly move, constantly go. And so this commandment to have a day when the whole nation rests is going to set you back. That's 52 days out of the year that you're not working, apparently. In fact, we know that ancient Israel had a problem with this command to an extent from our studies of the book of Amos. Do you remember what those who are buying and selling, who owned these stores, were saying in the book of Amos? Remember, they were saying, when is the new moon going to be over? When is the Sabbath day going to be over? So that we can buy and sell, 7 days a week. We can't take off a day. That's detrimental to our business. We need to work all 7 days. But most of the time, is it the boss that's working all 7 days? Who's working? The people he's got working for him, right? When people make the decision to be open on the weekends, it's usually the people that work for them that work on the weekends, not the people who, own the business in a lot of cases. And so when we have this commandment here, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, one of the reasons for breaking that would be for covetousness, for the love of money. Why else would you want to go out and to work all 7 days of the week and break this command? It boils down to the love of money. Look at verse 12. Commandment number 5 is honor your father and mother, that your days may be prolonged in the land which the Lord God gives you. What does it mean in this passage to honor your father and mother? Think back to what Jesus had talked about with the Pharisees and Sadducees and scribes. He said that, you are supposed to take care of your parents in their older age, but instead you've committed such a gift to the temple and basically said you can't afford to do that. And in doing that, you are not honoring your father and mother. So here in verse 12, when he says honor your father and mother, one of the reasons you might not do that is, again, because of the love of money. It all boils down to wanting to provide for yourself, wanting to prioritize yourself over others. Then all these commands that we have here, you should not murder, you should not commit adultery, you should not steal, you should not bear false witness. It all goes down to that sin of covetousness, of love of money, which is boiled down to, idolatry is another way to say that. Emphasizing something else other than God produces all these types of sins. Murder, adultery, stealing, bearing false witness. And then finally in verse 17, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Well, what does that lead to? What does that covetousness lead to? If you covet your neighbor's wife, what might that lead to? Might lead to adultery, right? Number 7, if you covet your neighbor's ox, that might lead to number 8, stealing. You might go and steal it. If you covet your neighbor's house, how might you get his house? You might have to kill him, right? Commandment number 6. And so all of these commands, in a way, can boil back down to that root of all evil command of, evil of covetousness, of the love of money, which again is idolatry, worshiping something in the place of God. So it's interesting to see how true that statement that Paul makes is there in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And what we're going to look at this morning is kind of how it plays out over the course of the Old Testament. What is it in our world as humans that drives us to create more inventions and better technology and all this stuff? Doesn't it basically boil down to, money? In some cases, it is for the good of all humanity. For example, the man that invented insulin, do you know how much he sold the patent for? Do you know how much he sold the patent for? $1. That's how much he sold it for. Why? Because when he created that, he realized it was a life-saving drug that could, save hundreds of thousands of people. And then how much does it cost now, right? How much does it cost in America to get insulin now? A lot of these medicines that we have, their original creation might have been for good. But what have companies done with that invention? They take advantage of people, and then you have people that die because they can't afford the basic medical care because of the greediness of these companies. You look at a hospital bill. We've been getting these hospital bills for Laura, and she's taking ibuprofen. One ibuprofen, $4. You're going, $4, man, I could have brought my own and given it to her instead of taking it from the hospital cabinet. Why are they overcharging? Why do they charge so much for that? Doesn't it basically boil back down to the love of money? So all of humanity, we've progressed greatly out of people who are sincerely trying to do good for others, but a large part of it is people wanting to get more money. They don't want to pay workers, so they invent a robot to replace the workers, right? That way they can have more money for themselves and don't have to pay so much out that way. If you go back into the Old Testament to Genesis chapter 10, we're just going to kind of skip ahead a little bit, or Genesis chapter 11. We're going to kind of skip ahead a little bit in the story to Genesis chapter 11. Notice what is introduced here, and I know we've talked about this specifically before, but he says in verse 1, the whole earth used the same language and the same words. It came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. This is near Babylon, what we know as Babylon. Now, we've talked about this before. I think this was y'all that I talked about this with. But in the book of Genesis especially, directions are ways that the storyteller tells about how people are, where people are going in relation to God. We talked about that before. So, for example, when they left the Garden of Eden, where did they go? To the east. They went to the east. And the angel was placed there at the east with a big sword, right, to make sure that they can get back into the garden. The tabernacle. You have the holy place, the most holy place, and the court there where all the Jewish people can go. Well, it's facing east. That way, as you leave the tabernacle, you're going further and further away from the holy place of God, right? And so when Cain kills Abel, where does he go? He goes east. He goes further east. So as they go further east, they're getting further and further away from the garden, which is sort of a hint to the reader, that they're going further and further away from God. Now, in Genesis chapter 11, as they journey east, they land in Babylon. Now, if you are reading this in, 500 BC, you're going, oh, this is where it all started, right? Because Babylon that took us into captivity for 70 years, this is where they began. This is where they got their start in this Tower of Babel incident. He said in verse 3, they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. They said, come, let us build up for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven, and let us make for ourselves, let us make for ourselves a name. Otherwise we'll be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. So the invention of the brick here allows them to build better cities and bigger towers. No longer do they have to go, so with Cain and Abel, they've gone from being migrant herders, right, to being able to plant gardens and have sort of a localized place where they stay, and they don't go from here to there, whatever fields they need to get to. Oh, well, now in Genesis chapter 10, we've progressed even more to where we have these large cities that are able to be built because of the invention of the brick. Well, if you are a king over a type of city like this, and you've invented this way in order to rapidly produce building materials, you don't have to go out and get stones from the mountains or anything like that. You have a way to rapidly produce materials. What do you do with that information? You build more, right? Well, how do you build more? You can't do it yourself. What do? You start hiring people. Well, that's not very productive, is it? Because if you hire people to build your cities, then what happens to the money that you produce from that city? It's got to go where? It's got to go back to pay the people that you hired to build the cities. So instead, if you're really greedy, what might you do? You might go and enslave people in order to force them to make the bricks to build the cities. And guess where we are in Egypt, right? In Egypt, why are they there? Well, they're there because of the famine and they go down there. But what was their primary purpose once the people who know Joseph died off? To make bricks, to produce storage cities, to fill the pockets of Pharaoh and his family. And so the invention of the brick here is important because it foreshadows Exodus, where Israel is enslaved for the sole purpose of making bricks to build these cities for Pharaoh. And so this invention of the brick boils down to a love of money, wanting to be able to rapidly produce these building materials to build up for themselves cities to glorify their name, as he says there. And this type of greed and covetousness produces opportunities for systematic oppression of those people that they captured and conquered, right? Of the working class. Look at Genesis chapter 12 now, and just kind of notice this. This is pretty cool. In Genesis chapter 12, Abraham lives where? Well, he lives in the same place. He lives there where they built the tower. He lives in Babylon, basically. And so Genesis 12, he says, the Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and your father's house to the land which I will show you." Now, where is that land? East or west? That land is back west, right? Because here we have the Mediterranean Sea. Here we have the Promised Land. Here we have Babylon. So he says, you got to go back. Well, he's going back west. He's going back towards the presence of God. We're using these directions again to indicate faithfulness. So he says, "I will make you a great nation. I will bless you." Notice this part here. "And make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So notice the shift from chapter 11 to chapter 12. In chapter 11, they are driven by the love of money, which is the root of all evil, to build these big cities in which they're going to use those to make their name great, which means they have to make somebody else's name worse off, right? To build up themselves. And it's going to lead to years of oppression and slavery and violence towards the lower class in order to build up the upper class there, the people that came up with the idea to build these cities and invent these bricks. Now, Abraham is the opposite. Instead of living in the luxury and in the comfort situation that he has as being part of one of these wealthy families in Babylon, he is told, you got to leave your country, you got to leave your relatives, you got to leave your father's house, you're going to go back west, and what I'm going to do is I will make you a great nation, not you. You're not going to make yourself a great nation. I will bless you, and I'll make your name great, and you're going to be a blessing, as he says in verse 2. And then he says at the end of verse 3, "In you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Not just your family that's way up here, but all the families. Do you see the difference between chapter 11 and chapter 12? And so in the New Testament, when Paul talks about having the faith of Abraham, being like Abraham your father, it's a call to go back west, to go back to this idea that all families would be blessed, to abandon this covetousness, which is the root of all evil, in which we just want to build up our one little tribe, our one little group, and go back and have grace and mercy for all. Go in your Bible to Amos chapter 4 for a second. Amos chapter 4. Here's what he warns here in chapter 4, verse 1. "Hear this word, ye cows of Bashan, who are on the mountain of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring now that we may drink." So one of the big sins in this chapter is oppressing the poor, crushing the needy, and basically, being abusive towards those who had not. Elsewhere in the book of Amos, as we've studied, before, he talks about those that were charging, too much for rent, charging too much for interest, just for the purpose of being greedy and taking advantage of people. It wasn't a fair deal where I give you a house, and yes, obviously I'm going to make profit off of it, but it was so ridiculous that it ended up being more of a detriment to society than it was for good. There's nothing wrong with making profit and making money, but when you pursue it so much to the alienation and oppression of other people, that's where God has a problem with it. That's what produced the bricks in Genesis chapter 10, and the faith of Abraham calls us to leave that type of lifestyle and abandon it. Let's go back to 1 Timothy chapter 6 for a moment. I want to hit on something else here. He says in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10 that the love of money is the root of all evil. All right. Whenever Jesus came to the earth, this is really what he focused on. Was this the root of the problem, not symptoms of the problem? This is one thing that we get into a lot, is we focus more on the symptoms than we do the roots of the issues. For example, one of the symptoms of living in a society that is driven by the love of money is, as we've noticed already, oppression, in severe cases, slavery. Sometimes the slavery isn't called slavery. Sometimes people are imprisoned by poor living conditions and poor wages and no opportunities, right? You don't have to have chains for it to be considered slavery. People that have to live paycheck to paycheck and always wonder where their next meal is coming from in the most prosperous country in the world, you could consider that a form of slavery if they're not being, if they don't have the opportunities to grow and thrive. So the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. This is really what Jesus focused on and not the symptoms. So let's say that you live in a country like that and you're a woman and you do not have a way to provide for your family. Your husband has died, you don't have any living relatives, but you have these kids. When you're reading the book of Matthew, or the Gospels in general, who does Jesus spend a lot of times with? People that were harlots, right? People that had to sell themselves in order to provide for their family. Do you ever hear Jesus condemn harlotry in the New Testament? I'm not saying that it's right, but do you ever hear Jesus condemn harlotry in the New Testament? Not in an open way like he did the Pharisees and the scribes in Matthew chapter 23. Now, he condemned fornication. He condemned adultery in several cases in Matthew 5 and in Matthew 19. But when he was with those who were considered sinners and publicans and harlots and things like that, he did not speak to them like he did the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, they knew that they knew what they were doing was against the law of Moses. They knew that what they were doing wrong. But if he hyper-focused on them, he's only focusing on a symptom of the problem. What if instead Jesus, as he did, focused on the root of the problem, the love of money? These people who said that they were followers of God and said that they were righteous and perfect according to the law, but really they were the ones that were causing these situations to begin with. They were the ones that had lined up with Rome to charge these expensive taxes that couldn't be paid, that would lead a woman to have to make such a decision, to begin with, you see? So what Jesus does is he attacks the root of the problem and not a symptom of the problem. The root of the problem is the love of money, which is evil. But see, that root, what kind of things does it produce? It might produce someone to chase after getting money in a legal way. But that's not the problem. That is a problem, but it's not the root of the problem. The root of the problem comes from causing such a social structure that would demand that someone does that anyways, right? If a young man is born in a poor low income area, he doesn't have any opportunity for good schooling. The free schooling that he has in the public school system, they just want to push you through. They're not actually teaching you anything substantial. What's his option when he gets older? When he's 16 and he decides when he drops out of school, what is he going to do? Is he going to go work? He was born into a family where he can go work as a CEO of a company and make millions of dollars a year, or does he turn to the options that are most available to him, stealing or selling drugs or something like that? You see, that's a problem, but that's not the root of the problem. The root of the problem is a society that would produce that type of situation anyways. We're the most prosperous country in the world, and yet this is how a lot of people this is how a lot of people feel like they're forced to live. The same thing is true with the issue of abortion. Abortion is a problem. It's something that we talk about a lot, but it is not the root of the problem. It's a symptom of a greater problem. Why would someone feel like that's the only choice they have to make to begin with? What does that say about our society as at a larger, at a larger whatever that is, plane or zone or something? I can't think of from a larger perspective. If a woman in our country, the most prosperous country in the world apparently, right? But number one country in the world, feels like her only option is to abort her child. What does that say about the country in general? What does that say about the situation that she's been put into and the opportunities that are afforded to her? You see, the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. Whenever we so blindly pursue money that we lead to oppress people and cause people to be outcasts and make people go into thousands and thousands of dollars in medical debt because they can't afford outrageous insurance prices, what does that say about the larger country as a whole? Now, there might be something that doesn't excuse the sin, that doesn't excuse the symptom, but what Jesus did was he focused more on the root causes of the problems instead of the problems themselves. You see what I'm trying to get at there? So what he says in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10, for the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. Okay, that's the root. The way that you kill the weed is by getting at the root, not hitting at the you can't just cut off the top of the weed. It's just going to go back, right? That's usually what I do. But you got to get down in the dirt, right? It causes you to get dirty. It causes you to get grimy. It's not just some pleasurable cut it off at the top with the weed whackers, right? You got to get down in there and dig around in the dirt. Same thing is true with dealing with this problem of evil. It's not enough to treat the symptoms. We can treat the symptoms all day, but if what's causing the headache isn't dealt with, then you can take all the Tylenol in the world. You're just going to have to keep taking more Tylenol, right? And so what Jesus did was he attacked the root. He said the problem isn't the people who are out here visibly sinning that are easy to attack. The problem is the people who say they're not part of the problem, who say they're not sinners, who say that they're righteous, not like this publican over here, that are really the ones that are causing all these issues to begin with. You see, if we do not take responsibility for the root problems of society, even though we might not be participating in the symptoms of the evil, then we are just as guilty as those who are practicing those outward, visible, easy sins to see, that we can so quickly and easily condemn, right? If we're contributing to the underlying issue of the love of money, which is the root of all evil, then we are just as guilty as everybody else is, okay? So the main points to take away from this is the love of money is equivalent to covetousness and idolatry. Often it produces pain for oneself, but also pain for everybody else around them, because they take advantage of the wealth that they have to take advantage of others in order to build up their wealth even more. If we're going to deal with the problems in our country, not only should we focus on the symptoms, which should be addressed and should be acknowledged and should be considered wrong and bad and evil, but we should also ask ourselves the very difficult questions. What is causing those situations to begin with? Why would a woman feel to be in that situation? Feel that that's their only choice? Why would a man feel like he has to pursue a life of selling drugs or gang-related activities in order to get by? What causes that to begin with? And what can we do as a society in order to make life better for everyone from the top to the bottom, and not just the bottom or not just the top? Make life better for everybody. What do we have to do? And the answer seems to be, at least, to attack this idea that the love of money, being covetousness, being greedy, which is idolatry. So, if you really want to make some people upset, you can point out that we like to say that America is a one nation under God, or a Christian nation, but it appears to be instead an idolatrous nation, like those of the Old Testament, because of the emphasis in our country of the love of money. Just get online. Well, how many get rich quick schemes do you see? And things like that. I mean, this is everywhere. And so what we have to do is attack the root of the problem and not just the symptoms of the problem. You can attack the symptoms all day, but it's never going to solve the issue. What Abraham did in Genesis chapter 12 was attack the root cause of the problem. He left father, he left country, he left what was comfortable. He got uncomfortable by going to a place that he was not, that he did not know about, and he allowed God to be the one to give him his name. He allowed God to be the one that would make his family great, and he allowed himself not just to be a blessing for his specific tribe or his specific group, but to be a blessing for all the tribes of the earth. Okay, and that's what we need to do if we're going to deal with the problems we have in our country, and if we're going to deal with the problems that we have all over the world, is attack the root and not the symptoms. Address them, and that's how you know that there's a problem, but get to the root of the issue and attack it there, okay? So whenever we look at politics, we're in an election year, we look at politics, when we look at who we vote for, when we look at who we don't vote for, when we look at who we protest against or march against or post about on social media, we've got to consider what's the root of the problem, how do we address that, and not just address the symptoms. All right? So there you go. The love of money is the root of all